All right, so last week we kind of went through chapter 3 and talked about the question of why does anything at all exist? So if I was to ask you that, let's do a little quick review and see if we remember what we learned from last week. What was the argument presented for why is there something rather than nothing?
Well,
well, first of all, we'll kind of break it down. So, like, what were the two possible characteristics that everything in the universe would be like? What characteristics would they have? They're either placed in this category or that category. So, what were the two categories?
Just got it. I forgot.
You're like right. It's contingent.
Contingent.
Which means what? What's contingent mean?
necessary, right?
It depends on something else.
Right. So it's not necessary. So if it's contingent, it doesn't have to be. And the other one would be necessary. So everything is either contingent or it's necessary, right? It exists necessarily. And so the idea behind the argument is what? When it comes to like, why is there something rather than nothing? When we look at the universe.
The universe exists contingently.
Right, because
there could be other particles or other, like, it doesn't have to be exactly the way that it is, but it is.
Right. So nothing in the universe
is necessary.
Right? That's what we're going for, right? So there's, like you said, there could be other particles or whatever. Everything that we see in the universe could not exist. It could be replaced by something else, right? There's nothing here that has to be here. So then the question is, well, why is it here? And that's kind of how the argument goes, okay? So if you recall, the first premise that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either, and this is what I'm talking about, like in order to really take advantage of what we're doing here, like write these arguments down and memorize them. Because then when you're talking to somebody and they're like, well, what evidence do you have that there even is a God?
So
like, here we go. Yeah.
what I've written down, that things that exist contingently has to exist because of something else, like the universe, like that's either it's God or an abstract object.
Right. So there has to be a cause, and there's only two possible categories. All right. So why can it not be abstract objects? Give me an example of an abstract object.
Because the numbers can't affect change,
numbers.
like they can't do anything.
Right. So they don't stand in a causal relationship. Like, so the number 3 doesn't cause anything. Right. If you really want to get deep into all this stuff, like there are people, and Craig argues this, that the numbers really they don't even really exist. They're just useful fictions. Like it's an idea to describe things, but like the number 3 is not there somewhere. Like you're like, God, I've located it. There it is. Right? It's like 3. It's a way of ordering things, right? So the first one is, the first part of the argument is that everything that exists has a reason, has a cause of its existence, either in the necessity of its nature. So it either exists necessarily or it's brought about by something else, some external cause, right? And then the second premise is what? Without looking, don't look. What's the second premise?
The universe has a cause for its existence.
Well, if the universe has a cause for its existence, then that cause
Must be God.
Must be God. Why?
Because it can't be, because God is necessary.
Well, hold on, let's go back. By universe, what does Craig mean when he says the universe?
Everything that exists.
Right, everything, all time, space, matter, and energy. So if it has a cause, then whatever caused it can't be part of the universe, right? It has to be outside the universe. And what could exist outside of time, space, matter, energy, and all that stuff? God, right? The attributes that we usually give to God. So that's why they're saying if the universe has a cause, it's God. Now, so you'd say, well, that's weird because an atheist wouldn't say that, would he? But we argued last time, yes, they would, because what's the atheist alternative?
Universe is absurd.
No, not well. That's the consequence we talked about. What's the alternative to the second premise here?
Oh,
Abstract God.
No.
The universe is necessarily existent.
Yes, so that the universe is eternal, that it just necessarily exists. It's just here, right? So if it's here, then it doesn't need a creator, right? It doesn't need a cause outside of itself. Then it's just been there all along, right? So that's the idea of the second one, is that if it has a cause, then the cause must be God, because it's got to be something other than the universe. Does that make sense? And then the third premise is what? Not looking.
The universe has a cause, therefore that.
It's a really easy one.
The universe exists.
The universe exists, right? So everything that exists has a reason for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or an external cause. If the universe has a cause, then that cause is God, and the universe exists. Right? That's it. So therefore,
The universe has a cause for its existence, and that cause is God.
right, that's the rest of the argument, right? Therefore, the universe has a cause, and that cause is God. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about any of that stuff? I'm assuming that everybody read all this stuff. This is kind of what I do at school, and I know that not everybody reads it. But it's there for you, so. But anything about, the videos are nice because they cover a lot of this stuff very quickly. So that's why I like to show the videos. But any comments about this? Now, let me say this before we get into the next argument. I said this in the first class. When it comes to all this sort of thing, there is no one argument that you could just lay out on the table and be like, boom, mic drop, there you go. God's real, you better believe it. Right? Just blew your mind, right? But all these work together to make a cumulative case, right? So what you'll find is, and we're not going to do this today, but I put a video up here from an atheist that's challenging the next argument that we're going to get. And so I watched it last night, and I was like, this would be a good test to see, like, because he makes a lot of mistakes in trying to go against the next argument. And part of that is because he's not taking all these arguments in together. So, like, one of the things with this is that if there is a cause, it has to be God, because it doesn't exist necessarily. That's kind of the takeaway from this. Since nothing that we see here has to exist, why does it exist? And if it couldn't exist, remember what we said, given an infinite amount of time, given an infinite amount of time, all possibilities will become actualities, which means that given an infinite amount of time, everything that could be eventually will be. And if it's possible for things not to be, that if we've been here forever, at some point it won't be anymore, and then there would be nothing, which is admittedly false, because here we are. So you're like, wait, we're here. So that's another reason why we wouldn't say that there's been an infinite amount of time that's already passed, because we're here, right? So how do you explain that? Does that all make sense? Stop me because sometimes like this stuff can slide by and then you're like, wait, what was that again? Right? Because some of this stuff, like I said, you got to run it through your head a couple times before it sometimes sticks to the wall, right? So it's like math class when you're going through stuff and the professor or the teacher explains it and you're like in class. This happened to me all the time. I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And then you go home to do it and you're like, wait, how does this go? Like, how do we do this, right? And then someone shows it to you, like, oh yeah, I got that. That's simple. And then you're like, wait, I have no idea how to do it. So that's what I'm saying. Like, you gotta kind of keep going with these things until like, eventually you'll be like, bing, and you're like, oh, I got it. And the best way to do that is to explain it to other people. Because when you have to explain it to other people, then you're like, oh yeah, okay, now it makes sense to me. Okay, so maybe go home and like get into a debate with your siblings or somebody and go through these things, and then that kind of helps. All right. Okay, so anything before we move into the chapter? Oh, by the way, did you read the little interludes here? Don't skip those, because his little journey of faith things where he talks about his life and how things work. Read those. They're really cool. Like, it's kind of amazing the way God works out. Like even in this one where he's like, yeah, I'd love to go study to get my doctorate degree in Great Britain. And they're like, oh, in order to do that, you have to have all the money up front. in the bank beforehand. And they're like, we're totally broke. We have no money at all. So his wife goes, did you read this? Yeah. His wife goes and talks to this Christian businesswoman, and she gives them all the money for him to go and do his doctorate. Like, what? Okay. So he goes, and then it gets better as it goes. So, all right, so read those. All right, so now we're into chapter 4. So this is dealing with what he calls the Kalam cosmological argument. So this is what he did his first doctorate on, right? The arguments and evidence for God. And he even talks about in this little prelude how when he went to Wheaton College, and he said at the beginning at Wheaton, the guy said, unfortunately, Wheaton at that time was surprisingly weak in apologetics. My theology professor, Robert Weber, taught us that there are no good arguments for God's existence, and that the traditional proofs had all been refuted. I was skeptical about his claim. Though I was skeptical about his claim, I more or less bought into what he said on the basis of his authority. So think about that. Like when he went to college, they were like, yeah, there's not really any good evidence for God. At Wheaton, what? So, all right. Fortunately, we have good evidence. There's always been evidence. In fact, one of the things that I want to do, remind me if I don't remember to do this, after I go through this stuff, I want to take you back and read a little excerpt from Thomas Aquinas. Have you ever heard Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas wrote a book, like he wrote a couple things, but his most famous work is called Summa Theologia. He wrote it in 1270. And in that, he gives 5 proofs for the existence of God. And you could align those 5 proofs with almost all the stuff that we're talking about in this book. And he goes through them all. And it's like, whoa. You know, and that was 1270. And even if you read Augustine, that was in the 300s. He gives a lot of good arguments in some of his work. So it's not like this is all new. That's the point. Okay. All right. So I want to share the screen here. And again, I like the video things that Craig has made, because they explain the argument in a very nice, quick way.
Go to the Microsoft Edge.
Like I said, I use Mac every day, all day. So everything's backwards. And this thing's got to go too. The zoom bar at the top. It's like right in the middle of everything. All right. So this is the main argument, and then I want to show you another video with the philosophical argument.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past.
You know what the red shift is? So because everything's moving away, you know how there's like Roy G. Biv, right, in the light spectrum. So because it's moving away, it shifts things towards the red end of the light spectrum, right? So because of the red shift, you can tell that everything's moving away. And the weird thing about the universe's expansion is, like, if you look at it from where we are, it looks like we're at the center because everything's moving away from us in all directions. But it's moving away from everything in all directions, right? Like, it's like if you, like he talks about it, I don't know if it's in this book or another book, but
It is.
so, yeah, where he talks about putting like
The buttons on.
buttons on the balloon, yeah. And so when you blow the balloon up, everything is expanding away from everything else, right? So it's like the universe is actually like just going bigger. And the idea of the general theory of relativity is, because that's, you kind of get gravity and a lot of stuff from a lot of Einstein stuff. But the point is that I want to get into the time thing, but like if you take the special theory of relativity and look at the way that some people interpret it, that they come to the conclusion that all time is relative and that there is no like base time for everything. But the idea from using the general theory of relativity is that essentially you could run everything that happened in the universe backwards, and so to give you like a general time of everything. So if everything's expanding, the idea is if you just flipped it into reverse, then everything would be contracting, and eventually it would contract down to essentially what's called the singularity, which is like the furthest back that they could postulate things. They call it Planck time, right? And so like after that, all the mathematical and physical laws kind of break down, and you're like, oh, can't go any further than that, right? But the point is, it looks like that cone, right? So if you were to run it backwards, the balloon would essentially deflate and deflate and deflate until it gets to such a small section that you just can't take it any further back than that, right? So that's the idea. Does that make sense?
It was a monument.
Well, actually, since it paused, let me just say this. So again, the idea of the Big Bang, the Big Bang, the name Big Bang was given to it by an atheist scientist because when this idea first came out, they realized the theological implications of this. Because again, either everything's always been here or it began. And if it began, just like we talked about in the last argument, anything that begins to exist has to have a cause, and that cause has to be outside of everything that's here. So like automatically you're like, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Because things just don't pop into being uncaused out of nothing, right? So like people didn't want that. So then the guy who kind of coined it was like, what, it just was just like a big bang, it just popped into existence? Because he thought it was a joke. And the more time goes on, the more you're seeing like, oh yeah, there's good reasons to believe that the universe hasn't always been here, that it existed. Now, again, within Christianity, you have, you know, the young earth people and the old earth and all that sort of stuff. I'll just come out and tell you my personal opinion is I'm kind of agnostic about all of it, because I am of the opinion that the Bible doesn't give us hard specifics on things. Like if God wanted to make a big deal about it, I think he could have been a little bit more like boom, boom, it happened like this. Like, so I'm fine with it being 7 literal days and being several thousand years old. I don't have a problem with the universe being billions of years old. My kind of preferential point is kind of a hybrid thing. I would say that like if I had to take a stance, my personal thing would be, I think that the universe is probably billions of years old, but I think that life on the earth is very recent. Like, I don't think that life has been here for millions and billions of years. I just don't think that there's good reasons to believe that. Like, I don't think that even when you find like red blood cells and dinosaur fossils and stuff, I'm like, that shouldn't be there, right? So, all right. So, but again, that's a secondary issue. Like, I think, again, the point that we're going for here is that in terms of evidence for God, the Big Bang is not an enemy of the Bible. It's just not, because the whole point that like I take out of the Big Bang is that the universe began to exist. However you want to say that, whether you think that, because there's some issues with the Big Bang too, because there's what's called an inflationary period at the beginning where it was like super fast and then it slowed down. Well, again, how did it go fast and slow down? Like, no one really knows that. And so there are issues. However, the point being that, like they're saying, and they're going to get to in a minute, that any universe that's in the state of expansion can't be infinite in the past, that it has to have a beginning. And for our points, that's the takeaway that we want. Like, it has to have a beginning. And even in the Bible, God talks about spreading out the stars and things like that. So however God did it, I don't know that. Yes.
How do we say that, like, where like God came from? If they ask, like, how long has God been there?
Right. That's okay. Should we get into that now?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So God, remember from the last argument, what did we say about God?
He's necessary.
He's necessary,
That is
right?
absolutely-
So everything that begins to exist has a cause. But what about God?
He's uncaused
Because
he created the cause, because he can't be caused himself.
He didn't begin to
he
exist.
didn't begin to exist, right? So think about it. And Aquinas argues this very well. There has to be, if there's something here, there has to be an uncaused first cause. Like Aquinas calls it the unmoved mover, because one of Aquinas's arguments is that everything is in motion. Which again, he said this in 1270. That's phenomenal that he said that, because it's actually true. Like, everything like, think about it from the large scale of things, everything's in motion. I figured this out the other day. I was talking about something like this in my class. I looked it up. I forget how fast we're moving right now, right?
When the universe is expanding at like the rate that your fingernails grow or something.
No, but the point is the Earth spins. So once a day, that's like 1,000 miles an hour. So just that is we're moving at 1,000 miles an hour. But then we're rotating around the sun, right? So like that takes you up to like 10,000 miles an hour or something.
66.
Is it 66? Yeah, you. But then we're in the Milky Way galaxy, so that's a spiral galaxy, so that's spinning, and then the universe is expanding. So we have this and this and this and that, and I figured you can look it up. I looked it up at Scientific American, and I like converted it from kilometers. It was like, what did I say? Like, it was either 600 or 800 some thousand miles per hour. We're moving right now, but it doesn't feel like we're moving, right? It's kind of like, did you ever do the experiment when if you walk and you throw something up in the air, it comes back down to you because it's moving at the same speed? That's why if you took a helicopter and you just went straight up in the air, you can't just like wait till the earth moves under you and just come back down, right? Because you're moving with the earth, right? Otherwise you could just like lift up and let everything go and just come back down a little bit. That doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it's like, if you think about if we all just stopped all the movement that's going on, we'd all just get like thrown against the wall or something.
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean that someone could orbit the sun in a year?
What do you mean?
You do.
No,
No.
we do.
No. Make a machine that orbits the sun in a year.
Every machine does.
Yeah, they all do, because all the satellites orbit the sun in the air, right?
You know what I mean, right? They're like something detached from the Earth that like goes around. So doesn't that mean that if it could slow itself down, then it could get to other planets faster?
I don't know if I follow what you mean.
You know how it takes like years and years and years, or for like these machines to get to other planets, or they say it would.
Yeah.
They calculate it.
Yeah.
What if they just like went off to the side and slowed themselves down from the 66,000 miles an hour that it was already traveling?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Just waiting for.
But you'd have to, you still have to be like, have the,
It's like,
it would still be, you have to accelerate.
Oh,
Go
to
the
catch
other
up to the speed of
So
the
like,
other
even if they figured out the Mars thing, like you have to try to figure it out so that you're getting there when they're closest in their orbit, right? And then somehow you got to get from here to there anyway, right?
Well,
So
there's
that's-
a way you can like slingshot off the gravity.
Yeah, they did that with the moon and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so back to the time thing. So, all right, I'm thinking whether we should finish this. All right, let me just, I don't want to get too deep on things, but think about it. If everything is moving, so we have the big scale and then even the microscopic scale, right? Like every cell in your body is moving and every cell is made of like smaller particles and the atoms are moving, the electrons are going around and all that sort of stuff. So everything's moving. And if you think about this, time, if you wanted to think of a definition of what is time without using time in the definition, which is very hard to think about because it's a measure of earlier than or later, right, or something like that, but that's still time. So I think the best definition of time is time is a measure of change, right? And so you could say, like, if I go like this, how would I describe what I just did? I could say it was there and now it's here, right? So there's a time component there, right? It was there and now it's here. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So again, if everything's moving and you have the time factor, then if you had a situation where you have something that's starting everything, it would have to start it simultaneously with the beginning of time, because it couldn't start it before time started, because there's no time, right? So, and again, there's another video about the philosophical part of this, but like I would say, and this is what Craig says, he has another fantastic book called Time and Eternity, which is a little bit more it's more challenging to read. So if you want to tackle that, it's a little, you got to kind of, you almost have to read it and then go back and reread it. But anyway, the point being that his idea, and I think I would believe this too, that God existed timelessly, which is to say changelessly, right? So like you have the God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit existing timelessly, and there's no change because also they're omniscient, which again gets into like a whole other thing, because think about it, like even the way we think, we use language as a kind of like our operating system to think, but like sentences have a beginning, middle, and an end to them, right? So even we think in time, but God, if you're omniscient, God simply just knows. It's called simple knowledge. He just knows all true propositions, just knows them, right? Which is hard, that's hard to think about, because like you never have a new thought, right? Because you would already known that you would have, you know what I mean? So there's no need to even communicate between the members of the Godhead, because they already know. Like so if you say, well, what was God doing before he created? He wasn't doing anything, because there was nothing. There was no change. It was just God existing in a timeless sense. So that's, yeah, when you get to all this stuff, the idea of God just there before is hard to grasp, because, and Craig uses the analogy of an unembodied mind, because again, God is spirit, right? So he has there's no matter to God, right? And now there's the Lord Jesus, who has a body, but prior to that, sans, now you can't even say prior to it, right? You have to say sans creation. Without creation, God exists timelessly. And then God, when he causes it simultaneously. When he does that, then time begins. And so that's why I believe that God then enters into time, because there's a change. And so there's sometimes people say, well, God's outside of time. But again, the only way that that's really possible is if everything always existed. And there's an idea for that. That's called the B theory of time. So I don't think the B theory of time is true. Like Einstein believed the B theory of time. I don't think the B, and Craig doesn't, and there's reasons for that, which we can get into next week because I'll show you the other video. But the point is, if you look at things like the incarnation, that's a change in God, right? So God, the Son, takes on a second nature and becomes man. He didn't always have the nature of being man, right? So that's a change. God existed alone without creation, and then he brings creation in. In the Latin it's called creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And so if that's what the Bible teaches, which I believe it does, not that God rearranged everything, but that there was nothing and then God brought it in, then that's a change. And once you get into time, you can't get out of time, right? So like that's why I think God is in time and he exists eternally, timelessly, without anything, and then in time forever, right? So we will exist forever, but we didn't always exist. Yeah.
I have a question about space. So is space infinite or is it finite?
Like now?
I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm just thinking.
It's, well, think of it like, so you can't get out of space because where would you go, right? So it's not like, so like, but again, space isn't expanding into something else. It's not like the universe is filling up the void that's just there, right? So it's just, space is expanding. So a lot of the stuff is very hard to think about. And I don't know that I could really explain it either because like it's not expanding into something else.
Yeah.
And it's not like you could you're not going to like get to the edge of the bubble right? and be like, I'm stuck. There it is. There's the wall, right? Like, yeah. So essentially it would be infinite. Like you're not going to like, kind of like the idea is kind of like you can't.
What you're just saying is like,
Like, 'cause
it's
it's
too much
even
for what you're saying is like it's too much for the human mind to comprehend.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like even if you were theoretically to get outside of the universe, you would be in space because you're matter, so therefore you have to exist in space.
Right.
So even if you theoretically could find the end of the universe, the instant you leave the universe, it's bigger because you're out in space somewhere. You have to be in space.
Yeah.
So is it uncaused?
What?
Or is it
Space?
Space?
Yeah.
You know, so space, but the point is, again, that because space is expanding and it goes back, that it began to exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't always. So again, like God existed outside of even space and time, which again, like there are ideas of like the different dimensions. So like the fourth dimension, people say it's whatever. So, you know, and somehow God is an unembodied mind that just exists. And again, that might sound like you're like just making stuff up, but it goes back to what we read in Romans 1. Given that we see all of this stuff, how do you explain it? Like there has to be, if it's all contingent and it's not eternal, there had to be a cause. And from the effects, we can reason back to what the cause has to be like, right? So let me, just for sake of time, we'll run the rest of this again.
Can we watch the flying spaghetti
No.
Mental discovery,
Next week.
almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into
See,
existence.
because they didn't
but one
like
by one,
the
these
kind of
models
conclusion
failed
that you
to
have to
stand
come
the
to,
test
that
of
there was a
time.
beginning.
More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
All right.
The balloon just
It's quite
The balloon
reasonable.
goes and it pops into the balloon pops as it reaches
it
the
goes up
atmosphere.
about 4 feet and a bird
Yeah,
comes
bird
along and little boy.
One of the pops up a little.
It's exciting.
Stop.
They're meeting today. What's that? Salad.
Okay. So any comments or questions on any of that stuff? Good questions that we had today. But I apologize because we kind of have to get the second part of this. So we'll hit that next week. And then we'll talk more about time and how that relates to everything, and potential infinites and actual infinites, and like, are there other, so like that was the scientific arguments for the cosmological argument. There's a philosophical argument too for it. So we'll do that, and then maybe we'll take like another week, and because I have these videos from these atheists who try to debunk this stuff online, and so I want to show you one of those and see if we can counter the debunk. See if we can show like why the debunk can be debunked, right? Like they're missing things that make sense, and we have good reason to believe. Okay, does that sound good? What's the class verse?
First Corinthians 10:5.
2 Corinthians 10, right?
Did you say First Christians?
No.
That's above the Bible.
Second Corinthians.
Yeah,
So
Second
sorry, you were
Corinthians
so
10.
confident.
We're right there.
First Christians.
All right, so let's close with prayer, and then
Yeah,
we can talk about your thoughts about the shining lights. All right, so Lord, just thank you again for this time that we can consider these things. It makes us marvel at who you are and what you're like, and how small we are compared to you, and how finite and weak. But we just thank you that you have demonstrated your love for us in the Lord Jesus Christ, that you are willing to become like us, but without sin, and subject yourself to the cross and the blows and spittings of sinners, so you would take the wrath that we have incurred and pay the penalty that we deserve to pay, Lord, that you conquered sin and death and the grave, and that we can have free access to your grace and your love and your mercy through putting our faith and trust in the Lord Jesus. So we thank you for these things, and I pray that you continue to help us as we think about these things that we've been talking about in class, that you would help us to understand more about you, that we could use these things to be a light to those who we come into contact with. And so we just pray these things in Jesus' name, amen.